My name is Antony Ebelle-Ebenda, and I work at Allianz in the strategic workforce planning environment. So it's more like the workforce transformation analytics. I've got this thing about this kind of like imposter syndrome. I saw all the presentation from Heather this morning, and I know that Lexi is going to have a big one later on. And mine is pretty basic, so we're going to have to get you involved a lot to make it entertaining. Otherwise, you're all going to fall asleep pretty quickly. So what I've done with regards to this presentation, when I was speaking with people, they asked me to do something around internal mobility and data, so facilitating internal mobility and data. And I didn't want to do something technical, and I thought it's easier to have an exchange and bring some information that is in the public domain, but that we can kind of like talk about. And I'm also going to put some examples within this discussion. So with regards to internal mobility, every year Deloitte, they do a global survey about human capital trends. And last year, 76% of the people who actually participated in that survey said that internal mobility was something pretty important to them, and 20% of those said it was one of the top 3 issues that they had in their organization right now. And everybody is kind of like saying, we need to have a better understanding on how to make our employees get jobs that we have internally. But in the same vein, if you look at some of the things that we've highlighted here, there's the respondent to the surveys, all of them, they said, the sad and maddening reality is that for employees, it's easier to find a job outside than it is to find in their own organization. So that begs the question, do we really take internal mobility seriously, or is it just kind of like a lip service to people who actually want to have this in their agenda? So one of the things that, if you look at this slide here, it says that 57% of people are saying it's either much easier or easier for them to find a new role that's going to be kind of like much more fulfilling for them in another organization versus theirs, the current organization. So when you look at that, at the very least, out of all of your employees, half of them who might be considering the next step in their careers would be thinking externally there's a higher chance of me getting something to fulfill my aspiration versus internally. So when we look at it like this way, it's kind of like a bit scary. So why, when we think about internal mobility, it is something very important. Currently in America, there's a very low unemployment rate. The lifespan of skills is shortened quite significantly. So in the past, and I remember my parents' generation, you could work in an organization and do the same job from the beginning to virtually the end of your career, or for many years. Nowadays, if any of you has done the same job more than 5 years in a row, I would be saying there's a bit of a problem, or there's a bit of a challenge with what you want to do going forward. Most organizations really change so drastically from the time you join them to where you are now that jobs change with them as well. So internal mobility is really important in that aspect, that in the past, people, when they had something new, they were thinking, if we create a new role, if we create a new function, we're going to go outside and get some external kind of like mindset, external workforce to actually plug the gap and make sure that we develop that new function. Nowadays, low unemployment, skill change really quickly. It's not efficient, or it's not sufficient enough for you to go and say, I'm going to go outside. You also have to look inside and see, okay, can I find within my organizations people that can help me with the transformation that I'm having? And this is where you start to think about this internal mobility strategy. Because without that, things become very dicey. So this is a little joke from Dilbert. And you can read it, and then I'm going to go to the next slide with regards to it. A lot of people right now, when they think about internal mobility, they see it as something very difficult. Unless there is someone that's really taking interest in your career, it's really hard it seems that it's really hard to find some roles outside of your predefined path. And one of the reasons is really explain in the following slide. So I worked at Allianz, and I'm going to ask you a very quick question. So Allianz, we've got what we call senior management and executive people. They represent about 4% of the organization, or 4 to 5% of the organization. Allianz has 140,000 people worldwide. So 95% of the organization is not in that category of senior executive and executive. If I ask you, can you guess how many internal mobility programs of leadership or development exist for that majority of people? How many do you think we have worldwide for Allianz? Have a guess. Any number? Okay, so we've got about 10. And we've got, for the executives, we represent 4% of the organization, a lot of those programs. Can someone have a guess on how many of those programs do we have for those executives?
Also 10?
No, we got 400. So if you start thinking, and if you look at this slide, when you're talking about what do we think today about internal mobility, a lot of the people are thinking it's limited to the executive ranks. If you think about Allianz as an organization, that would resound very, very true, because the majority of people have 10 programs for them, when you got less than 5% of the organization where we spend 400 programs to try to make them going in various places, looking at different pieces of the organization so that they can become much more what I call rounded around what Allianz as an organization is doing. So this slide is talking about moving from where we are today to where we want to be. And what people would want to be is feeling that we are part of the discussion. So when someone talks about internal mobility and have a strategy around it, that strategy is not only centered on those executives, but it's a strategy for the whole of the organization. And when you start to have that, then it also has some massive benefits for everybody. And I'm going to talk about some of those examples later on in the presentation. So when we started, I was talking about the data and the validation of those internal mobility strategy. One of the key things is it's easy to have lofty goals. It's easy to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. If you want to be really effective in having an internal mobility strategy, you need to set some goals. And you need to be able to measure those goals and actually see what you've achieved versus what was planned and what still needs to be done. And once you have that, you then look at things and say, okay, in terms of spending less money on bringing new people in, we've achieved that. In terms of getting people really kind of like institutional knowledge, staying in the organization, having a higher retention, we've done that. Engagement of people, we've seen an increase in the actual NPS score for the engagement. We've seen an increase in the people wanted to kind of like take on projects, wanted to reskill themselves, because we've done a end-to-end kind of like strategy that says, if you work at Allianz, after 6 months, we're going to give you an opportunity when we've seen the skills that you have and that you've registered with us and the discussion that you're having with your managers, we're able to say, there are opportunities out there in the organization that might not have been what you thought initially, but because we want to give you a chance to explore what Allianz has to offer, and I'm saying Allianz because this is where I was, this is some of the things that we can do. Now, just to talk about another example in terms of the mobility and the data and the measurement, in one of the companies I used to be at in the past, we wanted to see if moving people, giving them opportunity, had a positive impact on the organization. And because let's not kid ourselves, we all want to do what's great for the employee, but ultimately we're in a capitalistic society, and the companies that we're working for still want to make money. They might want to make money in a way which is ethical, in a way that is great for everyone, but if they don't make money, they're not going to go and try and invest, they're not going to try and do things that benefit all of the employees. And I used to work at Standard & Poor's. So Standard & Poor's, it's a credit rating agency. And the great thing about Standard & Poor's is that every year, we got about 60 to 70% of the revenues guaranteed, because there's only 3 big credit rating agencies in the world. You got Fitch, Moody's, S&P. And any company that wants to have creditworthiness, they need to get 2 of the 3 to certify their creditworthiness before they can go anywhere. So between those 3 companies, they make sure that every year, about 70% of their revenues are kind of guaranteed. So they only have to fight for 30% of it, which means that they're really willing to try new things and try to see if some of the intuition and gut feelings that people have actually translate into reality. So one thing that we did when I was there is like trying to understand what makes a great credit rating analyst at S&P. And we took 2 teams, and we said, over a 6-month period, for a few weeks, we took 1 team and we moved them from their environment to other places in the organization. So we try what we call pilot internal mobility for those people. And they still did their job, but what they also did, they went to see how does their job impact other places of the organization. And after those 6 months, we looked at what was the difference in credit rating revenues between the team that stayed to do the work they used to do and the team that moved around in the organization. And the team that moved around had a positive differential of 10 percentage points compared to the other one. Now, we worked with finance to understand what was the value of 1 percentage point. It was more than 200,000. So it means if you look at it, you got 2 million of extra revenue that you can actually say, by moving people, giving them an opportunity to see different things, they become more engaged, they become more kind of like innovative, and they become better at understanding how their job can be done in a different way to enhance, ultimately, the company P&L. So this is something where, when I was talking about the data, this is something that we can measure. And once you can measure that, then you can come back to people and say, look, we've done that, and we can prove with tangible data and results that it works. So this is something kind of like really important when we're thinking about this mobility item. Another thing, when I was starting, I was saying I'm going to talk to you about some of the other people who did something similar to that. And later on, I'm going to give you all those presentations, so there's nothing confidential in those. So Ingersoll Rand, this is a big company in terms of drilling and kind of like air compressors and things like this. They wanted to kind of like see if by having this internal mobility strategy, they would get some benefits out of it. And for them, the benefit was to see, do we get a higher employee engagement rate if we have this internal mobility strategy? They did that, and the result was a nearly 30% increase in employee engagement. So that goes back to my point about if you want to use data, you need to set goals, and goals need to be able to be measured with that data. For them, they were able to do that. Similarly to that, I mentioned something about Schneider Electric, French company. And for anybody who's ever worked for a French company, there's the headquarters and then the rest of the world. So that's the big thing for them. What they did, they said, well, now it's really difficult to get all the skill set that we need from everybody. We're going to try to change the way we have headquarters. So we created one headquarter in France, one in the US, one in China, one in India. And what it meant that in terms of the same way that you have graduate programs when they put you like 6 months in Chicago, 6 months in India, 6 months in Europe, they did the same with this organization, creating 4 headquarters, which meant that similar function happen in different places. So when you think about internal mobility, you then get the opportunity to go into 3 other places, learn about the culture, and come back, if you want, to your place of origin where you used to work with all this extra knowledge that will benefit you going forward. When they saw the benefit of that, they said, okay, We've done that for the headquarter function, but now we're going to expand that to the organization as a whole. So now they kind of like built at scale the change in allowing people to move from places to places, and they're going to try to measure to see how effective this is. So this is a little thing that I kind of like wanted to bring to you. So when you're talking about mobility, it's not just one space. It's not just the organization that needs to do that for you. It's also yourself as an employee. You need to be in a position to think about, where do I want to go? And there's another aspect which is really, really important. It's the technology. Doing the mobility, having the data, can't happen unless you have this HR infrastructure ecosystem that allows you to monitor, track, and after that, report on the information that you've stored. So like when every year you've got like your performance evaluation, when you've got your monthly meeting with your managers, and you actually have those discussions and saying, those are the things that I want to do, those are the skills that I have, we need to be able to kind of like track this and monitor it. So that when someone says, we want to have, I don't know, data engineers to be moving from London to Paris because we do different projects and acquiring those different type of expertise, if we have the database that can tell you that Dirk has been working in Paris for 6 months, and then now we want to send him in London, he's got those characteristics. If you have this in the database, you can readily have a conversation with Dirk and saying, we want you to experience new things because we've seen that you have those skills and we think it could benefit you. Now, ultimately, this is kind of like the organization that decides, but also the employee. But having that technology to support that strategy is really, really important. So my thing is, it goes back to this point that I had here, sorry. What it was here. This is this big sentence that I had with regards to it, in terms of kind of like the talent intelligence. You've got stakeholders in every part of the organization. If attitude reflects leadership, from the top, if you don't have this culture of, we want to give people the chance to move internally because our people already know our organization. Our people know our culture. If we give them a chance to actually go to other places, we normally going to increase the kind of like employee engagement, the growth, the retention, and other aspects. That should benefit us as an organization going forward. And if we have that, normally we should have less people leaving or people leaving for the wrong reason. So this is one of the big things for me. So and I don't want to put too much on it, and I wanted to kind of like get you guys to speak quite a bit and ask a lot of questions. But if I could have kind of like a little memo and checklist around the internal mobility and data, I would say, number one is everybody in the organization needs to be on board with that. If you don't have everybody on board, it becomes very difficult because you're going to have people saying, what's the purpose of this? So that's the second one. The second one is when you have managers hiring or looking for a new job, you need to have this concept of, let's look inside first before going outwards. It doesn't mean that it's always going to work, but it means that you give a chance to the people who are already in your shop to kind of like being given an opportunity to try something new, go somewhere else, versus as a default mechanism going for the outward. So that's the one. And then the third one is what I call in that tripod, it's all about the technology. Because when you have the technology, you can then provide outputs that measure what you were expecting versus what you're getting. And then you can also take corrective actions if you deem it necessary. So that's pretty much when I'm thinking about data and internal mobility, some of the things that to me are really important. And always remember, it's not a one-size-fits-all. What I've been talking about here is mainly for the big organizations that we worked at, S&P, Allianz, Deutsche Bank. You know, when I was at Deutsche, for example, I'm just going to finish with that. When I was at Deutsche, I joined them after my stint at PwC. I never wanted to become an accountant, but I spent some time there. And at Deutsche, I was given opportunities to go to many places. So I started in HR in London. Then some people said to me, oh, you understand databases, why don't you go and work for the CFO office in Frankfurt? So I went in Frankfurt, and I did some stuff, we were kind of like, okay. And then they sent me to London, but working for the CEO office. And after that, they said, oh, you're doing something interesting. Why don't you go to India to help us set up an organization? So I moved from London, Frankfurt, back to London, went to India, and then came back to London. So for me, it was kind of like great because someone took interest in my career, and it was not really what I expected when I joined Deutsche. I was expecting to do something about data and a bit of analysis, but always in the same place. Instead, because some people saw some skills that I had and understood some of the new things that we were doing, they gave me opportunities to experience different things within the organization, and that enriched my career, and that also enriched the organization. And so when I left the organization, I left it with a very good feeling in terms of thinking, they looked after me, they helped me grow, and that's why I am where I am today. So that's, in conclusion, some of the things I wanted to say. Internal mobility is something that's really important, but we can't just let the organization do everything for us. We need to take an interest ourselves in our careers, but we also need to feel that the process around internal mobility is transparent, and if we go and speak to people, we're going to get at least an answer. It might not be always a positive one, but at least we're going to get an answer. And to me, what I've seen in organizations that made it successfully, data and the technology were at the center of it. Because if you got the technology and if you got the culture and everybody understanding what needs to be done, then there's no excuse for not looking at people and giving them opportunities internally. So that's my little presentation. And now, if you've got questions, I'm going to try and answer. This is really, really difficult for me. Brilliant. There's one here.
Farida Furutan, people analyst from Adobe. My question is how you defined internal mobility in your analysis. Obviously, there are different kinds of movement, and we don't expect the same result out of every, mobility. Just a change in location. Is it considered mobility in your analysis, or there are different factors?
Okay. So basically, there's a microphone, so I don't have to repeat the question. But when we look at mobility, there's different aspects of it. So you could have geographical mobility, which is one thing, but there's also mobility of roles and activities. Because, roles, when I was started, I said roles change quite a bit. So if someone says to you, I've seen in your CV that you might be working in HR right now, but I've seen in your CV that you're pretty good at coding. Why don't you go and do a stint in this new kind of like IT group that we're having, which is at the cross-section between HR and IT. So to me, this is also some internal mobility. But in order to do that, it goes back to my point around we need to be able to record those various skills that people have, and being able to have a tool that we can interrogate so it can help us when we try to make those type of decisions. So yeah, when we're talking about internal mobility, it's beyond just the geographical one. There's also the skills and there's also the activities that people can do differently in different places. Oh, there's another question.
Oh, thank you. So one of the things I think you mentioned that I think is key, but I think it's very challenging, is to get everybody to buy in. I've seen different dynamics on that, where leadership will say, we want to do internal movement, but in reality, there's resistance at different levels. Mm-hmm. So I'm just kind of curious how you may have handled some of those situations because the situations are there without us even being able to measure something, and maybe do something more in a smaller group and measure success that way. But I'm just kind of curious what you've seen as successful.
So I'm going to take a very concrete example. So at Allianz, there's everybody from the board down has some objectives. And those objectives actually have an influence on how people get rewarded going forward. So for Allianz, when we're looking at the strategic workforce planning and the internal mobility elements, the board has some objective that they need to reach. And if they don't reach those objectives, it has an influence on how they're getting the information. Now, when you're at the top of the food chain, you never want to look not successful. So when those elements affect you directly, you're making sure that they cascade down and everybody adheres to that approach. Now, it's a bit totalitarian in the kind of like getting things done, but this is where I've seen it working. I don't know if there's some other ways of doing it, but I always say if senior management has some skin in the game, and that skin is pretty heavy for them, normally you would see that they make sure everybody else follows the same path. So that's what happens at Allianz. And that's why it's kind of like working right now. So, I don't know, any other questions?
If you do have questions, you get to catch Antony on the side because we are out of time. But thank you very much, Antony.
Thank you.